All right, so I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar at Salt Spring Solutions. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are hosting this event on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Hulkaminam and the Sinchothan speaking people. My name is Pam Tarr. I'm the engagement manager at Salt Spring Solutions. I'm so honored and thrilled that you are all here to join us for a really interesting conversation today. We have several presenters, and I'd like to turn this over now to our very able host, Elizabeth FitzZaland.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Elizabeth FitzZaland, and I'm a volunteer and the co-chair of Salt Spring Solutions Society. And I'm here also tonight with several of the other board members who will be joining us as participants, and also a few people who are helping behind the scenes. So many of you may know Darlene Gage, and she'll be moderating and helping with the polling questions that we'll be doing throughout the evening here. But yeah, you'll see some of our other colleagues here tonight. Salt Spring Solutions was created in 2018 in response to the fundamental and pressing need for change on Salt Spring Island, the home that we love here. While blessed with fertile land, a temperate climate, and an intelligent, engaged population, we have not, as a community, taken the necessary steps to ensure a resilient island community into the future. We want to help evolve this so-called argument surrounded by water to become an effective community where diverse voices band together around common values to solve our most pressing issues, including watershed and biodiversity protection, social equity and climate justice, reconciliation, and climate action. Salt Spring Solutions envisions a resilient Salt Spring Island community that works together to equitably care for the ecology and the community as one. Our mission is to make space for new voices, bust silos, and collaborate across diverse views and opinions and interests. To do this, we work to identify key issues that need attention, to open up decision-making processes to a wider audience, and invite people to use their stories, their voices, and their actions to get involved to make a real difference. We build alliances and organize collaborations among diverse groups, organizations, and local government bodies to create equitable solutions to our community's biggest challenge. And of course, housing is one of our community's biggest challenges. So this is actually a topic that our organization has been working on very closely for several years here on Salt Spring Island. Some of you may know and can find on our website. Oh, I don't know if anyway, it's just a big blue blur, but we'll show this to you later. Sorry about that with my my effects here. But Homes for Islanders is a report and framework that we created, an integrated housing solutions framework for Salt Spring Island that looks at how to address things in the island context. And that's also what we're here tonight about. And while we have lots of conversations here on Salt Spring around this topic and have been fortunate to be building alliances across the Southern Gulf Islands to have these conversations, we're excited tonight to be welcoming in some other voices beyond Salt Spring Island to share in this discussion and to bring some new ideas and maybe some old ideas, but thought out differently in today's context to help expand what we understand in terms of good solutions and to have a discussion around how that could work on the islands and in small communities. So it's a huge pleasure to have Small Housing BC here tonight, and also to have the Galiano Cottage Co-op here with us tonight. And is this back? I'm sorry, I'm just checking here. Is this where I do a poll?
We're going to launch a poll.
We're going to launch a poll. Okay, sorry, I'm a little new to webinars. And so we do have some polls for everyone this evening. There's just 3 that are peppered throughout, and it's really to get a sense of who's here. So if you could respond to the poll that's up right now, that'd be great. And that will, Darlene will share back what we learned in terms of where everyone's from.
Perfect. Elizabeth, looks like for sure the majority is Salt Spring Island, but strong contingent of Galiano Islanders. a few from Maine, a few from Penders, Saturna, and Bowen are also represented in the house tonight. Other islands in the trust area, sorry, we didn't maybe get as far north as we could, but I'm assuming from some of my Facebook chats that some friends from Hornby Island are probably joining us tonight, and those are the folks that are now represented from that contingent. Let's just see here. I'll share my results here on the screen with you and show you who else is in the room. And then we have other BC communities, but nobody from outside of
Gabriella
BC.
here.
Gabriella, fantastic. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. This is a great smattering. Obviously, we share a lot in common across the Gulf Islands of British Columbia.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's nice to see this representation, and that's definitely something we've been working on at Salt Spring Solutions, is really trying to reach out more to the other islands, recognizing that we have so much in common, and that by sharing information and banding together, we can have a much larger voice, especially provincially. And so it's great to see so many different islands who are sharing this interest tonight. So I'd like to introduce Small Housing BC. Small Housing BC is a housing nonprofit at the forefront of innovative gentle density solutions. Oh, look, it's right up there on the screen. It actively partners with government, industry, and homeowners in championing the gentle density of our neighborhoods, driving progress through shaping policy, refining regulatory tools, promoting cutting-edge home designs, developing performance for sustainable growth, and creating models for affordable housing. Their unwavering commitment builds sector capacity, ultimately boosting the supply of progressive solutions that can deliver the homes that people want and need. In my day job, I work with nonprofits and First Nations and Indigenous groups and varying levels of government on housing solutions and housing projects. And I can say that Small Housing BC has been a tremendous resource. Their research is welcomed and very useful, and they're really being turned to more and more at all levels of government for best practice. So we have Jake Fry and Carl Isaak with us this evening, and so I'll hand it over to the two of you.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Really pleased to be here with you virtually. Of course, I would rather be on the island and enjoying some time out there, because I think it's a beautiful place that I have actually yet to visit in the province. So it's definitely on the bucket list and the near-term place to come to, because I think we are, as an organization, very deliberate in reaching out to communities of all sizes. And so while we often are working out of our Lower Mainland office with governments and industry in this area, we're also reaching out beyond that, and just wanted to share a couple of the places that we'd worked with recently in BC. So Nelson is a town in the Kootenays, a similar population size, I think around 12,000. And one of the opportunities I've had since joining Small Housing was going out to visit and talking with an official community plan committee there about their options for how they can choose to grow in the future, whether they want things that are backyard infill homes, duplexes, row homes to kind of be complementary to the existing neighborhood. And these images are all drawn from a little bike tour that they let me take through the community to really immerse myself in it. I will say that it's something that's got a lot of traction in the community. People see that there's a lot of need for it. But Nelson's not the only community that's a smaller community or in a more rural setting. On the island, there's the village of Cumberland that's done a lot of work around how do we make it easy for property owners, for the community to actually know how to build laneway homes for their family, for others. And they've done a great job in sharing guidelines around the actual production of accessory dwellings. So those are just a couple of the communities that Small Housing has interacted with, and certainly we have a network of 100 planners in over 55 different jurisdictions that are kind of signed up as part of our community practice. And what we hear from them is that it's small communities where they're getting a lot of interest in building, and they are looking for support in how to do this. So we're pleased to be able to provide that to them. But moving on maybe towards the why of, I think, how gentle density, what we call small housing, homes that fit within neighborhoods, is a good fit for rural areas. And these are things that are true of gentle density in many contexts, but certainly there's added nuances when it comes to things like aging in place in a more rural community where there may be fewer options for downsizing to something that might fit your budget or maintenance needs as your lifestyle changes. So I think people are really looking to find opportunities where they can construct something either for themselves that might be more appropriate for their life stage, and then have family move into the main house, or construct something for family so that they can live nearby and potentially do some shared caregiving situations, or even just looking for income as they may want to retire and have that opportunity. So it's something that's worked across the province. We're seeing it certainly outside of BC, across the continent, as a real trend that is meeting the needs of people who want more housing options in their community. Another particular consideration for communities, and I drew a couple of headlines from recent editions of Salt Spring Media around a particular school closure. And I think the inability of younger families with school-age children, especially, to be able to afford to live in communities where maybe what limited options are acreages and tend to have higher values. It's a pressure on the school district, not in terms of growth, but sometimes in terms of actually filling seats in schools that once had a more affordable for families option. On the right, that's actually my parents' house. They moved in and built a duplex with my sister, and the three boys that are working on building the volleyball court on the bottom were school aged when they moved. And my parents' original intention was actually to build on Salt Spring. So they looked and looked and looked. They weren't able to find anything that was suitable or where they could get the right zoning to build a combined intergenerational home. And I think that it is a motivation for people to relocate, to be able to find a spot that suits their family needs. Maybe somewhere where they grew up and they went to school elsewhere and want to come back to the community. But if there isn't an option that is within the neighborhood, maybe close to their social capital, their families, it becomes very tough for them. Another headline was around the challenges that businesses and other institutions face in retaining employees or attracting employees when there aren't housing choices for them that fit their budgets. So you do see signs about shorter restaurant hours, things like that. And one of the things that smaller homes in particular do is, even if it is new construction, it's going to be relatively more affordable than a newer home that's a detached, larger home, just by virtue of the size. And over time, that does become your housing stock for workforce, for people who are frontline workers and other necessary parts of our economy. So we can't just leave it to the folks who are wealthy enough to go to the restaurant and eat and enjoy. There has to be opportunities for people who are also going to be working in the economy. Lastly, one thing that we've heard from is actually a comment from a building official from the interior, so not on the island, but they were feeling like gentle density or small homes were actually maybe being underplayed as an important option, because they're saying we actually already have these frequently in our community and they're not that well inspected because they're illegal. They're not currently permitted. They were aware of them just through by law enforcement or things like that, but the construction standards may not be there because since they're not permitted, it's not something that they get out to do the building code checks on. So I think a good reason to enable and to allow for these in your community is because they, in many cases, already exist, and offering a pathway to becoming officially inspected is a way to ensure better safety for the residents. I do have a couple slides about who we are, and I think your intro did describe us very well. We do work in a range of activities. So while we are advocates and supporters and pushing governments to do more and to try new solutions and take risks through kind of the proven solutions that we're offering, we do research, and we also work with industry, and that's everybody from builders to lenders, anyone really involved in the housing production process. And some of the legislative context that we're currently working with is that under the Homes for People plan, and the recently announced legislation in November is that what was once something that we were suggesting and proposing as a great idea for communities is now something that's becoming mandatory in many communities to offer this option. And so we're certainly looking to support cities and communities as they look to enable laneway homes and duplexes and other forms of gentle density in their communities. And it's not just that they're left without resources. The federal government is coming in with a few different housing programs. So both industry through the Housing Supply Challenge has a large source of funds to test out and to scale up innovative ideas in housing. The Housing Accelerator Fund for more of the government side has a lot of funds that are available to do new actions. And there's just a couple clips from housing action plans in some towns that talk about increasing opportunities such as pre-reviewed or standardized designs for these smaller forms to make it easier for people to navigate the building process. So we're happy to be here and to meet with the folks from Salt Spring and here from Galiano as well, because I think it's a conversation that's really important across the province, and really want to be supportive of your efforts here and to share what we've learned. Thanks.
Thank you.
No,
Go ahead.
oh, hey, Elizabeth, I'll just jump in to dovetail a little bit. Carl has been with us at Small Housing BC for a while. He comes to us with a great pedigree as a planner and quite an array and a really fulsome career. In contrast, and complementing that, I'd founded Small Housing BC in about 2012, really in many respects, out of the kind of a bit of a quite a robust interest and success we'd had initiating a laneway house program in Vancouver, and our company was one of the founding sort of service providers, for lack of a better term, for that type of housing. And you know what I'd like to do, just to add to Carl's comments, I think we can't lose sight in many respects that we're at a point, and it applies to the Gulf Islands as much as it does to more built-up communities where we have land, and we're in this transition where younger people already have not only trouble getting in land, but I think almost of equal importance, we have people who are on properties that are quite large, they have a lot of equity, and they themselves are exploring what they can do both for families and for themselves around housing. And this is where I think the name Small Housing BC really starts to really emulate what we feel is an important part, which is that generally we've had a whole course over the last 40 to 50 years in a movement of housing to get bigger and bigger and larger. And we know across the country, we're also seeing this from empirical census data that we're having homes that are 30 to 40% bigger over the country, housing almost half the population they did in the 70s. And so we need an adjustment in housing. And I think when we have communities that we cherish, and we want to see those communities flourish, and we want ourselves to flourish in those communities, we need to look at how our housing and how our communities are organizing themselves. And it's within this dialogue that we have done our research and also really acted as an agent for many people who've come to us, looking to understand what options are available to them. And increasingly, when people are thinking about their immediate needs are and the needs of their families, they look to these solutions. And what we found through our research and now our 10 plus, 12 plus years of activity is that we also understand that as these new or revisited building forms start to enter into the communities genuinely benefit from them, and in many respects benefit disproportionately from what, say, a larger project might bring when we look at just affordability. When we look at the balance of the community, we really see that this is the gentle and the humane route forward as we look at what are we going to do as we continue to grow and there's more people to house.
Thank you so much, Carl and Jake. I personally have so many questions, and I'd love to I wish this was the forum where I could just ask all my questions, but I know that's not what this forum is about. So I did want to let everyone know that while we're going to go to the next presenter from the Galiano Cottage Co-op, we will have an opportunity to circle back with questions to Jake and Carl, and that if you could put your questions in the chat, we're going to try to get to as many of those as we can. And yeah, thank you so much, Jake and Carl. I'd like to now introduce Abby Bryant from the Galiano Cottage Co-op. So the Galiano Cottage Co-op is a newly organized nonprofit housing cooperative with a mission to create secure, market-priced, long-term housing on Galiano Island. Their approach is centered on accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, which can be up to 860 square feet on Galiano under the existing zoning. The co-op hopes to build and lease ADUs on privately owned residential lots all over the island, as well as on a central lot owned by the co-op. They have secured early funding, I believe, from Van City, and are working on a pilot project to develop a prototype and test the approach. So it's so nice to have a neighbor here tonight to share. So I'd like to pass it over to Abby. Oh, I think you're muted.
Let's see, does this work any better?
That works great.
Fantastic. So thank you. I mean, that was a great summary. I think I can, maybe start by giving a little bit of a context, which is that Galiano, like I think, all of our islands really has people have difficulty finding affordable housing. Buying housing for, especially for younger folks or younger families is increasingly very difficult. But there's very little in the way of rental housing. And in particular, there's effectively nothing that is dedicated to rental housing. So the only kind of purpose-built rental housing or dedicated rental housing on Galiano is the Page Drive Seniors Housing, which itself, has a long waiting list, but also, doesn't help for anyone who isn't eligible as a senior. And so, I've seen, many great people in Galiano, some of whom I can see are on the call here today, who have put many years of effort into purpose-built affordable housing projects on Galiano. But it's just been an immense amount of work, and I think the work will continue and the projects will come to fruition. But it's years of fighting zoning battles, years of trying to work with government funding programs that seem not really to be intended for a context like Galiano. BC Housing, I think, would much rather be doing larger housing developments and a lot of those programs than what sort of ends up making sense on the islands. And so I was looking at, could we develop a model that does not rely on any particular sort of governmental funding program, and also fits within existing zoning and sort of existing land base, rather than requiring those kinds of rezoning and community consultation processes. And so we started the Galiano Cottage Co-op. As you mentioned, it's a nonprofit housing cooperative. And our model, in particular, our initial model that I'm going to describe was really kind of tailored to the very particular environment and zoning and so on of Galiano. Since, as we've kind of gotten started, we've expanded a little bit the model. So we'll describe the initial model, and then I'll also describe some of the ways that we've expanded it. The initial model is that the co-op gets financing, and we were very lucky to get financing from the Van City Community Foundation, and in particular to lock in that financing just before the interest rates went up, which was just very fortunate for us. But the co-op borrows the money to be able to build accessory dwellings, and on Galiano, most lots, basically any residential lot that's at least an acre, have the right, as well as for a house of any size, they have the right for what we call a cottage of up to 860 square feet now, which is, pretty sizable. It's kind of a small 2-bedroom house. And, lots of people have built these, but there are lots of homes on the island where people have a main house, but they have not built that right to a cottage. And so the premise is that the co-op makes a deal with someone who owns one of these lots and who has not built out the cottage, that the co-op will, with the funding the co-op has arranged, construct a cottage on their land. The co-op will not, the co-op will then lease that kind of land and cottage from the landowner for a period of 20 years, basically for free, right? There might be some nominal payments, but for very little in cash. At the end of the 20 years, the landowner gets the cottage, right? And so this ends up being quite attractive, in particular to people that might have young children, and they can imagine, right now they don't have the resources, either the financial resources or the kind of, organizational bandwidth to do a build like that themselves, to manage having a tenant in it and so on. But they can imagine that 20 years from now, it might be really great to have that home either for an aging parent or for a kid who's just come home from college or something like that, right? So that's an attractive proposition. And from the co-op's point of view, it means that the co-op doesn't have to spend any money on land. The co-op is taking advantage of kind of density that is already zoned in. And you just sort of, it's about whether or not the economics can work of spending the money to build this house and then getting no more than 20 years, getting basically exactly 20 years of use out of it. But especially with kind of interest rates as they were, it kind of pencils out, right? And so the whole thing kind of works. So that's our model. That's still the model we are most focused on, and I think that we can sort of scale the most. We also have kind of expanded the model a little bit in two ways, kind of opportunistically. One is that people have come to us and said, well, I already have a cottage, right? Maybe that can get kind of enrolled in the co-op. And so there's a sense in which the co-op can maybe become a little bit of a kind of aggregator of rentals, kind of secondary rentals on the island. And those can maybe be leases for shorter terms than 20 years. But the co-op can kind of both act as a property manager, and also it adds some amount of security for the co-op members over just individually renting one of those, because although we may not, in the kind of the model really kind of explicitly has this thing built in that we can't guarantee a particular unit forever, as long as there's enough housing kind of moving in and out of the co-op members should be able to move, if they lose a particular location, should be able to move somewhere else, right? And so the security of the rental housing is something we've seen is particularly difficult here. People have to move very frequently, and they're very uncertain about, where their next, spot is going to be, right? The other sort of opportunistic thing that we did is a piece of land came on the market that was just too perfect to pass up. It's right behind the school. It has the right for 6 housing units on it, and it was priced in a way that just made that really look very attractive. And so actually, the first thing that we're doing, what we're working on right now, and are going to be, probably spending most of 2024 on as well, is developing that central lot. So we kind of started out intending to be a very distributed housing co-op, and in fact, what we're doing, to begin with, is a much more traditional housing co-op thing of like having a piece of land and building a bunch of housing on it. But that's great too, right? It also, it's good in that part of the plan all along was to have sort of a single design, the economies of scale from a single design that we replicate. And so it's kind of nice that we have a chance to kind of build 3 of those. Actually, we already have one mostly built on another piece of land, but to build another 3 of those and really, have something people can come see and know, exactly what they're going to get on their land, and also have a really good sense for what it's going to cost us to build each one, and have an opportunity to kind of really fine tune that approach and where we can find savings and where we can do kind of, bulk purchases and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's what we're doing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Avi, for sharing. And again, I already have so many questions, but I think we're just going to go through this as I've been directed to do. And I do see some questions going into the chat. So thank you so much for those. We had some questions that we already had down here that I'd like to put back to our presenters. But first, we're going to do the second poll. And so this one's just a short one. And it's really asking if people here who are on the webinar today, how many of you have friends or family who are in need of housing? And this is actually, some of our presenters helped us pick out these poll questions. And this is one of the ones that came from one of our presenters, I think, just to get a sense of context here.
So far, we're in the 80% of a yes, climbing now to 83% yes, around 20% no. Nobody is unsure. Everybody is pretty sure whether they know somebody who's looking or not. And definitely the vast majority of folks are saying definitely they know people who are looking for housing. So I'll share those results with you now.
Thank you, Darlene.
Not a surprise there, I would say.
Not a surprise. Yeah, in 2022, the Salt Spring Island Foundation did the vital signs report that they do with some frequency every few years, and they have extensive consultation and research that they do as part of that. And the number one issue is housing, and it came up in all the conversations, not even the ones that are focused on housing or economy, but it came up in conversations around conservation, around climate change, around transportation. It's just, this is just such, it's all connected in our small communities here and throughout British Columbia. So not a big surprise, but good to know that a lot of us are feeling this quite personally, not just conceptually. And so the first question I'd like to put to our presenters today is this one. So there's a lot of cool things that we hear are happening in urban places, and we just heard something cool happening over in Galiano, and Carl shared some examples from Nelson. But oftentimes these examples are coming from places where infrastructure is plentiful, where because of land scarcity, there's a natural move towards density. And there's general more acceptance for compact housing because of the history of development patterns, or how things have gone in more urban or dense places. Here on Salt Spring, and I know throughout the Gulf Islands, we often struggle with pushback because of real and perceived limitations on development. We're curious how examples either from Galiano or from other communities that Small Housing BC or Jake's company has been involved with, how they're dealing with these things such as limited infrastructure. And concerns from communities around that, or other impacts on small communities that bring out kind of a not in my backyard, pushback on this type of development.
I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, jump in, Jake.
But I'm going to say there's a lot to unpack in that question. So I think there's a few things. If we're looking at, and we need to turn our attention to the Gulf Islands because that's our target audience here. I think there's some pretty interesting opportunities. And first and foremost, it's what we're proposing, and I think it's common to Avi as well. I mean, we are speaking of smaller size structures, and we know the environmental impact on them are much lower than, hey, let's take this property with a 2,000 square foot home and now put 2 other 2,000 square foot homes. I mean, there's something fundamentally different, to build something that's quaint, attractive, and a visual asset to the community is meaningful. And it's important too that it is small because of these things, the scarcity of water, scarcity of power, and so forth. And so there's something that's already sympathetic to that. And I would add, in addition to that, as we look at the province moving towards Step Code 3, 4, which are more rigorous approaches to buildings and the performance of buildings, that in itself really helps enhance. If you were to take it, and this is just an aside, but it's an interesting one. If you were to take in an urban setting like Vancouver, and we did some studies on this, if you were to take the rainwater out of the system that was happening as you added lane homes, you took all the rainwater and groundwater from that foundation system and from landing on the roof of that building and diverted that into a rain garden. So you were able to just dealing with that rainwater on site, and you added low flush toilets and taps to your principal residence. The net output of that building goes down about 15% from when it was just a home on it. So adding a home, but thoughtfully thinking of what you might do to the principal resident actually lowers the overall impact of what's happening on that property. And those are not rare and Mother Jones kind of out there ideas anymore. These are off-the-shelf components that you can get from Home Depot or from your neighborhood building store. So that on that infrastructure point, we don't see that as a really the type of burden that one would expect if you're saying, well, we're going to double the population of the island and double the same type of homes that are currently being built. So I think that's a fundamental lens that we need to put on this discussion.
Maybe I could just have a quick follow-up to that, because I think you bring up a good point there. Maybe you could just speak to it just a little bit more. I mean, I think that often that is how ADUs are framed, that it's just that it's going to be an equivalent household to, if you were to have, just it's an equivalent household. So it would be if, let's say, that you allowed ADUs across Salt Spring Island or across any community, you're essentially allowing for a doubling of the population.
And the question is that sort of the outcome, or?
Well, would that be your do you think that that's well-founded?
I don't think you're ever going to get a doubling, but what you are going to do, if you look at the overall growth of a community, and how do we want our community to grow? And if a community is going to be bringing in more people, which there's more people on the planet, that's naturally going to happen. And as our demographic of the boomers, because I'm just in the bottom line of a boomer, but as we are aging out, there's going to be a big transition of land, and with that transition of land is going to be an array of pressures around that land. And even a place like Salt Spring, there'll be pressures for multi-family developments, whether it's recreational or housing. And how do we want to house those people, and how do we want to house those people on the land? And that's a great discussion to be having now, because that's all coming down the pipe quickly. And we put forth in the work that we do is that we're seeing we're much better off dispersing that population very gently into the existing community with a very sympathetic approach to housing than we are on trying to do what historically has been done for the last 30 years, which is to build bigger structures and have multiple families in one large building. And that type of pressure will be seen and will be coming to the Gulf Islands in one form or another. And to Avi's point as well, as if we take a piece of land, are we better having one large house, or are we better off, maybe not housing too many people, or are we better off having like a nice little cottage courtyard where we have several homes which are attainable to a population, which probably have maybe even less of a footprint on the property overall, and yet they're able to house more families with, I would argue, equal, if not less, impact overall, and certainly a lower impact when you look at the general health of the community.
Thank you. Avi, do you have anything to add from your experience on Galiano?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my main response to the question is that I think urban and sort of municipalities, even small municipalities in BC right now are seeing lots of support for these kind of, build fourplexes, build lots of these kind of multifamily developments. And, I think it will be a long time before that is an accepted thing to do on the islands. And I mean, not to take a kind of, normative position on this, right? I mean, maybe we should be doing that, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. I think we can, have a lot of conversations about the relative kind of climate impact of denser housing versus less dense housing and so on, right? But the fact is, just as a practical matter, right, that is not something that there is support for here. And so, what can you do and yet, I guess my point is, there is a lot that you can do within the existing zoning, within the existing restrictions, right? There is a lot of density, that is permitted currently, certainly on Galiano, and this will vary island by island, that is not utilized, right? And so, I think we are all going to have the hard discussions over the next 10 years, 20 years about whether or not we do need to allow more density. But in the meantime, the kind of pragmatic thing that we can do is take advantage of the density that is already allowed. And I see enough work, over the next 10 years just doing that I'm not going to worry that much about the fact that, compared to urban environments, there are fewer things we can do.
Yeah, and that really does strike home here on Salt Spring quite a bit, where the most natural, when I put my planner hat on, best practice would say we really need to densify Ganges. And I think there's generally a lot of public support for that. But then in reality, we have a water moratorium that prohibits us from densifying Ganges. And we also have concerns around sea level rise and other things that actually make that a much longer term goal. So it really is a community conversation around, okay, well, if that's not in our near future, how do we address the housing crisis now? And I mean, so far tonight, there's been some ideas around that. And certainly in other communities, we're seeing uptake on the dispersed density model. I know in the Southern Gulf Islands and their housing strategy. And so for the benefit of Jake and Carl, sometimes Salt Springs is considered part of the Southern Gulf Islands, and in other times it's everyone but Salt Spring. So so in the everybody but Salt Spring version, the CRD talks about islanders helping islanders, and so that's the idea of instead of having this on nonprofits or developers, that it's this dispersed density right into the neighborhoods, which is what Small Housing BC has been advocating across the province. I think that it's time for our third and final poll, and then we'll get back to some more questions, because I know there's several coming in here. So I think that this third poll is specifically around ADUs and cottages, and everyone here tonight, your experience with them. And you might want to just read the answers first before you pick yours. But do you have experience with secondary suites or ADUs, such as cottages? So you can say, yes, I own one, but I don't rent it. You have it for personal or family use. Yes, I own one, and I do rent it short-term or seasonally. You own one and you rent it long-term. Or yes, I rent one as your form of housing or as a nightly accommodation. And then there's some other ones there at the end, but if everyone can just take a minute.
And just for our non-housing policy wonk folks, an ADU is an accessory dwelling unit. A cottage, a suite, above, below your main residence, beside, that kind of thing.
On Salt Spring, it could be a yurt.
Yurts. Caravans. In Hornby, we have lots of caravans. So it looks as though we're coming in pretty strongly on, yes, I do own one that I rent long-term. We also have a few folks who are saying, no, they don't have any experience with this form of housing, but looks like those are the top two coming in so far. I'll give it another 10 seconds or so for people to choose.
Previously owned and rented, previously lived in one.
Oh, yeah. Me too.
Yeah, this could have been worded a bunch of different ways.
It's fine.
So there we have some results for you. Looks like there's a smattering across all of these forms, but For a lot of folks, in fact, the majority of folks don't have any experience with any of these types of housing, but some do rent seasonally or long-term.
Right. So people have experience, 35% or so don't have experience, but 60 or more percent do in one way or another. So it's out there in our communities. And I think that with the economy the way it is, and then also the legislative changes, we're going to see this more and more across BC. So we have a next question up is construction cost and interest rates are going up, which makes it hard to rent ADUs, so affordable accessory dwelling units like cottages and suites at affordable prices. What are best practices for making compact housing affordable and gentle density affordable? What can our community and local governments do to support affordability of these forms of housing?
So I have maybe two kinds of answer to that. The first is we're looking a lot, because we intend to do this kind of iterated development where we're building more or less one cottage at a time, and we intend to, over the years build a large number of these. We're really looking at how we can, develop templates or engineering plans or that we refine over time to keep the costs down. And I think one of the ways in which we hope to keep the cost of building down is simply by having a single design that we can reuse over and over. But there are other things that keep coming up as we look at this as sort of high cost items that we are hoping to find ways to make cheaper. One that is particularly expensive right now is septic, right? So I think in some cases we will be able to tie into existing septic systems, but I don't expect that to be the norm. Usually a septic system will be sized for, the dwelling that's already there. And if we're adding an ADU, we are going to have to either expand or add a new septic system. And I think, a lot of people are not aware that Island Health is comfortable with alternatives to septic systems that have been sort of blessed by an engineer, right? And so composting toilets, for example, are perfectly legal as long as they're engineered. One system that we have been looking into that I think almost no one realizes exists is incinerating toilets that use electrical power, and the output is ash, right? And so you don't need a septic system. You do still need a small gray water filtration system and kind of, small kind of field, but it's much less, the requirements are much less strict, and it's much, much cheaper to put in than septic. And so, I think that's a way to save probably, between $20,000 and $30,000 in one of our builds. We're also really interested not in prefab construction, in part because I think it's nice to have sort of the labor force still be on the island, but also because I don't think like prefab and bringing onto the island really works out as being much of a cost savings. But there are some prefab-like construction techniques that we believe, sort of at a somewhat larger scale can reduce the cost of construction. So two that we have been working with are structural insulated panels, which are these kind of sandwiches of solid insulation and plywood on either side that makes, a whole wall unit that can just be kind of stood up. So you don't have any studs, you don't have any, insulation put into it, you don't have vapor barrier, you just kind of have a solid wall unit. The other is insulated concrete forms, which are kind of these like foam Lego blocks, and you can really almost like build a wall with them as if it's Lego. They're super light and they're super easy to kind of work with. And then once you've built your structure, then you pour concrete into the middle of them. And so then they both serve as the form for the concrete, but then they stay in place permanently as the insulation. And so this particularly it adds the material cost, but it reduces the labor cost, and we can actually, build with them much quicker than with some traditional techniques and with fewer people, right? So, you know, our hope is that by just kind of pushing on a bunch of these alternative techniques and paying the costs upfront once to, for example, work with an engineer to, you know, to approve or design these alternative, whether it's septic systems or alternative construction methods and so on. But then that gets amortized over a large number of builds. That's a way to keep the cost down, right? The other side of it is, I think affordable housing is extremely important, but housing is important, right? And I think that like our perspective is, yes, we hope that this housing or some of this housing, we can find ways to make it affordable, you know, by the kind of definitions of affordability in terms of, you know, the income bands that can access it. But even just adding more rental housing into the marketplace, even if it's at market rates, I think is very important and very valuable to the communities. And so even if that's all we achieve, I will still count that as a success. Right?
Yeah, here on Salt Spring, we have a 0% vacancy rate. So we could use some more market rental. Carl, Jake, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just put something to the chat there. It's a resource that we developed in conjunction with a few other partners that talks about a lot of ideas that it would take way too long to go through all of them. But I just want to talk about some of the bigger buckets or categories of things that you can do. So we looked at reducing barriers to market supply. So if we're looking at the time involved in getting approval to build a accessory dwelling unit, if you have to go through a 3-year rezoning process and there's a lot of uncertainty and risk there's a lot of people who just won't even start that. And so for those who do go through that process, and more power to them, those units are going to bear the cost potentially of all of the interest payments that they had if there was a mortgage while they're waiting, any kind of additional consultant costs. So there's barriers that will be different in each community. And some of the things that have been suggested in here are around pre-zoning to allow for a faster process. Certainly across the community, that's one thing that's happening with the legislation. But there's also things like looking at standardized home designs, which has now been something the province is looking at procuring. They've announced that that's going to be happening. And Small Housing BC has certainly worked. One of the things that we did in Nelson was doing that for the laneway or the ADU type homes, and other communities have done that as well. So that's one way to increase the ease of approval process potentially by the plan checkers at the city. And time is money. So things like prefabrication. I think there was a question in the chat I saw about affordability and do we have experience with that? And I think one of the things that we've learned in talking with people who have gone through that process, it's not just necessarily the hard costs of doing the build that are the cost driver there. It's really the time that you spend on site, meaning that there's less impact to the community and that there's, again, less interest being paid to the bank while you're waiting to complete the project. So those are just a few ideas. Again, facilitating below market housing is something that is wonderful in concept. And for those who are from a housing society, I see a few, I think from Main Island and others, know how difficult it is to make a project pencil out, to actually develop that without significant support for operating costs for below market rents. So that is something that can be looked at as a component of the model, but likely is going to require more partnerships to make that happen.
Thank you. I think one more question before we kind of go to the questions that have been coming in the chat. So short-term vacation rentals or short-term rentals are a huge concern on Salt Spring Island, and I know on several of the other islands, maybe not all, but many. So many people are concerned that if we build more cottages and suites and accessory dwelling units, that what we're going to see is an increase in nightly rentals of those units, and not the long-term housing for locals that we're looking for. what are the best practices for keeping this housing stock long-term and local? And this is, I'm sure all three of you are very well aware that this last month and the last year, but really the last 45 days, there's been so many changes in legislation or proposed changes in legislation for British Columbia. And the Gulf Islands and actually the whole trust area has been exempted from most, if not like almost all, of that legislation. And so we're in an environment now here in the Gulf Islands where the communities that surround us have the option or are being mandated to enact different policies and regulations. One of them is for short-term vacation rentals in particular. And so we're seeing that more of these neighbors are getting protected, but it kind of almost shines a spotlight more strongly on our communities in terms of a good place to go to start a short-term vacation rental or to purchase a second home. And so before, I guess maybe for some of the best practices that have come down in the last few weeks don't necessarily apply to us yet. But maybe you could think a few weeks before that what the best practices are, because that's kind of the paradigm that we're still in.
I'll just go quickly, I think, and let others follow. One thing that I've heard recently is that for the communities that are under the provincial short-term vacation rental rules, if you are looking to ensure that something isn't removed from local residents, is to look at stratifying the unit. So allow for the separate sale of a laneway home if that's possible, to ensure that it has to be a primary or principal residence in order for it to be allowed to be a short-term vacation rental. So that would be somebody who then only rents it out for part of the year. But if you haven't done that, if it's just a rental in the house, then likely the revenue that you get from renting it out on a nightly basis to a guest would be higher than the long-term rent, as you're seeing already. So stratification, even though it might seem counterintuitive and making something available for sale, and rentals are needed as well, may be a path to preventing the kind of widespread Airbnb or other platform kind of conversion of some of these units, or when they're produced that they're diverted into that supply. An initial thought on that anyhow.
Jake, do you have something?
I was just going to say, the interesting part from our practice, just to give a sense of volume, we've built about 400 of these ADUs. Is that, what we're finding is really the people who want to proceed with these most frequently tend to be family members associated with a property owner. And this becomes sort of housing for adult children, becomes part of estate planning. And so while I think there does need to be legislative and local bylaw to balance out, things like short-term rental, I do think when we start looking at what someone's going to want to put in and when they really want to put in an ADU and what they're looking at, I think in the current market, citing some of the factors that you talked about, that construction's gone up, interest is going up, I think naturally you're going to find people who really want to live in them are the ones that are doing it, because the opportunity to have a fairly seasonal rental that's short is not going to be the same sort of immediate money maker that it might have been a few years ago when construction was lower and interest was, basically free. So I think there are some market forces at play that will help mediate at the same time, or mitigate, I should say.
Yeah, so I tend to agree that I'm just happy to see the housing get built, and am confident that the existence of the housing is probably going to end up being a net positive in the long run. But I do think that perception exists, and I do think that the possibility of seasonal short-term rentals, certainly on Galiano, has taken a lot of housing out of the kind of long-term secure rental market. People might be able to rent a place, September through May, and then they kind of get kicked out for the summer, and that's just not, that's not a good way to live. I think I think it is possible to put incentives in place to kind of lock down some of this housing, and important to do that. And I think one tool that I would love to see get used more is housing agreements, with the regional district, right? So it is possible to make an agreement that goes on title, and this is only possible with governments, that restricts the use of your property in certain ways, or in fact requires certain uses. And so it is possible for the CRD to make an agreement with a property owner that will go on title and run with the land, that say a cottage needs to be used for long-term housing rather than for rental housing. Why would someone do that? Presumably because they're being given some kind of incentive. They're being given some kind of, forgivable loan by the regional district, some kind of property tax break, some kind of something. And we've seen some of these programs in other places in the province, but I'd love to see more of that being done here as a way to kind of, try to lock up some of this housing for rental. But then I see what the co-op is doing as also along similar lines. We aren't a governmental body. We don't have the kind of enforcement teeth that something like a housing agreement does, but we can still take long-term leases on pieces of land or units, and ensure that for the duration of those leases, they will be used for long-term rentals rather than short-term rentals. And so I see a valuable role in sort of housing organizations potentially doing that, and you could imagine having communities impose a requirement that this rezoning will let you build an additional cottage if it gets through one of these societies or through a housing agreement dedicated to long-term rental rather than short-term rental, right? That is the kind of thing that that a local trust committee, for example, could require, right? And not totally unlike some of the requirements that exist now to do conservation covenants or sustainable forestry covenants in order to do certain kinds of rezonings and subdivisions. So.
Thanks, Abby. And I know that some of our trustees from the Islands Trust are on this call, and I know that many of them would probably say, hey, and you can also just zone it so that you're not allowed to do that as well. And so there are a variety of tools, and I think it's about which tools are the right ones and which ones can you enforce best. It's kind of part of what our toolkit is. It is I believe that we can also, the Islands Trust could opt into the new legislation on short-term rentals. And I'm not sure where that's at with Trust Council, since there's a lot of different islands that Trust Council represents. But I'm hearing here on Salt Spring pretty loud and clear that we'd love to be opted in. So pitching that one to all of our trustees out there too. Let's see, I think it's time to turn it over to questions from the folks who are joining us here on the webinar. Can I turn to Darlene or Pam to let us know which questions have come in?
Yes, I think since we were just talking about short-term rentals, we might add the question that our group was hoping to ask, that since we've been exempted from a lot of this new legislation, we're wondering if anyone has any advice for us on how to strengthen our case to the provincial government.
I feel like this is a Jake question.
I think what we found most frequently, it's really, I think politicians and political appointees really they're very sympathetic to what they hear. And I think it's a matter of having a discourse and advocacy amongst the population to see where the consensus lands on these issues. You will have dissenting and varying viewpoints for sure. And that's just normal community building. But I do think it's a forum like this, and it's other forums that can happen in public settings that really start to take the temperature, of what a community wants. And I think then that is the best conduit to really start to make some of these decisions, and I think the nice thing about an island is that it's a contained area, and you can start to collect that information, and there's the grocery store, there's the stores in town, there's the mail service, there's all these really nice defined ways in which contact is eligible to be fostered. And I think those are really, that bottom line, that's this community building, and that's where it has to start. It starts at that grassroots level. But I do know from my work over the last few decades, politicians, when they hear consensus, and if an idea is novel, but there's a genuine voice behind it of support, they tend to be open to seeing change happen. And whether that's a change of a new form of housing or a new form of legislation, it's not hard for someone to say no when they know that with the yes is supported, right?
Jake?
Elizabeth, you started to ask a question about potable water being, top of mind here. And we were hoping to ask the presenters if they have any information about how water use compares between typical detached homes and ADUs or small housing, and ideas how to address the concerns of our community. We have a lot of people writing in about water being, our water moratorium being, one of the biggest problems here.
Thanks for the question. I think I don't have detailed measurements. I was able to kind of confirm, newer faucets use typically less than half of the water flow that older faucets do. So this is something, with a small housing type being fewer bedrooms, there's going to be less water use, and just the fact of it being newer construction would also have a mitigating effect on that. So whether it's if a larger new home or smaller home, the newer lower flow features are going to be beneficial there. See, Jake wants to add on.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in, and I am going to mirror what you're saying, but I think that's another initiative that would be so easily, I think, would be quite easily supported, which is if the built form that we're looking at right now, then there are lots of other things we can be discussing around smaller housing, but if it is something like that additional unit, predicating the permitting of that, it would be based on, a house specifically around water, everything's switching over to low flow. So there's a capital cost to build one of these. It's going to cost a homeowner an extra few $1,000s. But at the same time, you're only adding a kitchen and a bathroom for the most part. And if you switched everything else in your principal residence to low flow, and that could apply to both electricity, run more economically better or environmentally better performing electrical appliances and utilities, you can create a threshold where your capital investment overall might go up, 10 or 20 grand, or some nominal number, but you're actually going to decrease the amount of energy that the current principal residence or the overall energy in the property is going to be less than the current principal residence uses, and the water consumption can be less than what the principal residence is using, even though you've added another smaller residential unit in the property. That to my mind, that's a very easy way.
Yeah, and I know also, just to add to that a little bit more, because at Salt Spring Solutions, we've also dug around quite a bit on the water piece. And then also I'm involved with one of the water improvement districts here on Salt Spring Island. And, the majority of our residential water uses are actually outside uses. So if you're having, that's an interesting thing to think about and try to figure out how to calculate that in, that if there's a shared vegetable garden and shared landscaping and shared things outside that are taking a lot of the water, that adding another dwelling doesn't double that necessarily. So some of those things come into site planning and some of the design things that you mentioned, Jake.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think we should also be making more distinctions than we do between potable water and non-potable water, right? So I think, rainwater catchment is fantastic, and it's also very expensive and complicated to get your rainwater system sort of approved for potable use inside the home. I did visit a friend on Gabriola who has one of those systems, but they're relatively rare. But using rainwater for the outside things like you're talking about would, of course, be fantastic. Using rainwater to flush toilets seems sort of like a no-brainer, right? And so I would sort of hope that as we look at standardized designs for these kinds of things, that we would start building in some of those solutions, start building in water catchment and sort of dual potable versus non-potable plumbing. I did hear about, I was talking to an engineer that had done some work on, I think, a Salt Spring Senior Center that has done that, has kind of, I think they call them purple pipes throughout that are their rainwater pipes and are used for certain things separately from the others. So obviously it's out there, but I'd love to see that become much more common.
Pam, another question?
Yeah, I think, we might go back to one of the broader issues that a lot of our audience is concerned about, and that is that, we'd love to know how you suggest that we can best reduce the impact of new housing on the natural environment and natural systems.
No takers? Oh, there we go.
I mean, that's a big question, Pam, and it's hard to really. It has a number of answers. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, and although it's not really used as much as it was, but I think we all know that LEED housing, right? LEED housing, which is um, the early kind of forms of trying to make more environmentally sensitive housing. The biggest thing in which they had a gradient and you'd be scaled, and the biggest thing you could do with the most impact was to build small and to create smaller residences. And I think when we look at overall impact, there's just so many things to be taken into account. There's, of course, what immediately comes to mind was what happens, you're building something, land's being disturbed, trees are being used, and trees are being cut, and there's a certain amount of impact on the land. But I mean, there's also the impact on community around building, what type of communities built, how a city center is built out and so forth. But generally speaking, and obviously, we're here as advocating for this, the opportunities when we start to be a bit more selective on what we build, and that what we build has both a visually and a physical sort of smaller impact, but at the same time has the same dynamic of being viable housing for families. In terms of what's being built is appropriate for who's going to be living in it, and is able to meet those needs and create a good standard of living without being without having a lot of excess material and excess space. I mean, those are sort of guiding principles around what we advocate for, and I think there's guiding principles because primarily they have a more modest impact, but at the same time have a very significant. They have a small environmental impact with a really significant community impact, and a positive one, I would add.
I'm going to give an answer that will probably make me quite unpopular, which is that, I mean, the best thing that all of us could do for the natural environment would be to move to Vancouver, right? I think that, denser housing, that not having the carbon cost of ferries bringing goods back and forth to the island, right? If we really were optimizing for climate and for nature, we wouldn't be living on the islands at all. Obviously, we all live on the islands for reasons. We love living here. I love living here, right? And we make trade-offs, right? And so I think that, I would love to actually see denser villages and more parkland in all of the islands. if I were really going to, play God and write the legislation, right? But failing that, I think it is important to house people, and I think that the way that we can house people practically under the current system is by building small housing and building accessory dwellings. I don't actually think that that is the best thing for the environment, right? I mean, I think, as a practical matter, we will cut down more trees doing that. We will probably have a larger, kind of carbon impact. We're spreading out the water use more, which is good. But from a carbon point of view, I think we're actually, the kind of small housing and what my organization is doing is not the best thing. But it is the possible thing. And so, until we get to build really dense housing, which I suspect will never happen, and that's fine, right? I think we need to recognize that that what we're doing does have a cost, and we have to hope that the benefit we get from it makes it worth it, right?
Thanks for that. Is there another question for us, Pam?
We have so many well-informed people here asking wonderful and very specific questions. And I just want to add that we are going to ask our presenters to kindly chime in on answers for things that we are not able to get to in the amount of time that we have here. But I'll ask a specific one here about water. It says zoning also can regulate the requirement for residential use as a condition of vacation rental use. SSI zoning currently prohibits STVRs anyway, so the opt-in would not change that. And the zoning would still need to be opened up to allow it other than B&Bs. If advocacy is advanced, it might be more strategic to focus on other aspects of the new legislation first, such as the ADU incentives. So that was one response to our people in our chat are having a conversation about our conversation, basically.
Parallel to Zoom.
Yeah, exactly. And it's exciting to hear from one of our trustees that the local trust committee has passed a resolution authorizing a letter to the Minister of Housing requesting that Salt Spring Island be included in Bill 41 as if it were a municipality with a population of greater than 10,000. So we'll see how we do with that in terms of approaching government inclusion on some of these issues that we seem to be not included on. And maybe a more general thing for us to end with here would be, Small Housing BC talks about the concept of gentle density. And we're wondering how you think that would look here on Salt Spring, as much of our development is characterized by detached homes with lots of 2 acres and over. Many of the people in the chat have been saying it's important to look at traffic issues. How are we going to move people to their jobs when we, if everything isn't happening all in one dense place. So maybe you could talk a little more about gentle density for our listeners.
Well, I'll jump in if I could. I mean, I think to begin with, I think we've talked quite a bit about these granny flats ADUs. I mean, that's as gentle density, I think, in many cases as you're going to get, and there's a number of ways to make this housing that's environmentally sensitive, and it has many of the factors we talked about with, it's not standardized plans, standardized approaches to how we build them that can make them more economical. I mean, we've been building panelized homes for 16 years. So, I mean, this is not a new thing, and panelized homes have been built and packaged, and kids' homes have been built since, certainly the early 20s. The last century. So, I mean, these are tried and true methods, of that. But I think that another thing too, it'll be really interesting to see as again, when we start to look at what might happen in larger lots. I mean, we've looked at, and it's just something I particularly really like as a design. I think, design really helps, and thoughtful design everyone thinks this being pretty, but like, what is it? How do we want to approach this? I mean, we had did a kind of an approach where we often try and create a story. So we looked at a piece of property for somebody in one of the Gulf Islands, and it was a big piece of land, a few acres. And we said, well, really, what would be nice here is if we created something that looked like it had been here for a long time. So what we designed was something that looked like an old farmhouse that was really a fourplex. And then we did landscaping that looked like that there had been an orchard there. And then we put smaller cottages around as if they were worker cottages or dry sheds that we that had been converted into residential units. So we created a story of a pre-existing apple orchard. And so someone would drive by and it would look like this was a building from, say, the 30s or the 60s, and it was quite quaint, and it would have fit in quite nicely. It would have been something you, in driving by, would think there was this really interesting story. But really what it was is 12 units on an acre, and yet, or 2 acres, I should say. And yet it was really modest, and certainly its environmental impact would have been more than one residential house, but not much more than one big house. When you looked at the square footage, because we were dealing with 600 to 800 square foot living spaces. So I think that's a version of what could happen, and I think it's that dynamic thinking that is a necessity. But I also think you have these Gulf Islands. People do love them, and with really good reason. They're beautiful places, and I think people like to see really beautiful things built around them, and people like to build those. That's what the market will call for. I mean, you're not going to really get that many strip motels being built on Salt Spring, especially if that's what you're going to propose is for someone to live, right? So I think it's seeding the market with good ideas, and it's for the legislative regulatory people up there, it's allowing for those projects to foster and finding those champions that set like a high benchmark, and then others will follow.
Thank you so much, Jake. I was just going to interject with a question. I hope I don't get in trouble with Pam. But I did notice it early on, and I just wanted to make sure it got brought up, because with the work that I do, the bottom line matters so much always. And so I'd be curious. I know the question came up, I think, for Avi in terms of like what the build cost for your model at this point, what that's landing at. And I don't know if maybe, Jake, just based on your experience of building so many, if after hearing that, if you also wanted to comment on, some building costs for, kind of a more humble or approachable cottage development.
Yeah, I mean, for us in Galiano, for our design, we're seeing about 400 a square foot. And, I'm curious how that evolves as we build a few more, and hopefully both that goes down a little bit, and also I'll have a more precise idea of sort of what it looks like, in different, kind of deployed in different environments, right? But that's kind of the target that we're looking at is 400 a square foot.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I would say, Abby's price is rightish. I mean, I do think there are a few different approaches. I mean, certainly, I think there's one of our colleagues in Vancouver has 60 houses that they're looking to move, and they'll give them away for free, and that becomes a really interesting project for an ADU. It's not without cost. It would still be a few $100,000, but that's, there are those options. I know the lower level of kind of prefab, but not unattractive prefab kit homes, they're coming in under $200,000. Our homes, we have one, and we'd have to adapt it to the island, but that house within the Vancouver setting, it's quite a nice little house, and then we designed it to be as economical as possible. And that house is sitting around $300,000 for 1,000 square feet.
And do you think that you could come in at something close to that cost on the island? I mean, I don't know whether that's something that gets prefabricated and brought over, or whether that's something you would need to be, have workers on the island doing. But that comes in considerably better right, than we're looking at. So my ears are perking up.
Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
some
we have a
relationship building
whole,
going on.
yeah, we have a pretty unique building system that we utilize, and it would 100% be more expensive on the island, and it would have to utilize a labor force here. But the more you can self-produce on the island, the better. You know, having lived on Hornby on and off, you know, there was lots of great carpenters, and you know, if someone's already living there, it's a lot cheaper than bringing over crew. And if someone's working with a kit rather than a pile of raw material, it's more efficient to build a house.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, we do have the phenomenon here on Salt Spring where all of our builders are tied up building large, beautiful, fancy homes for the most part. So it can be hard to find labor sometimes around here, which I know is happening across the province also. Another question from you, Pam, or from the group?
Sorry, sure. So I guess we sort of talked a little bit about gentle density, but we're wondering how you have seen other small communities like ours integrate density with success and have a minimal impact, you know, in the areas that you're working.
So I guess that's kind of a question of like you, Carl used Nelson as an example, but kind of looking for some other examples, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then here's another one that might be good. It says, are the presenters aware of any jurisdictions where rainwater outdoor non-potable water use on properties with ADUs or all zones is legislated and functioning? Salt Spring has a published study of water system use averages that demonstrates that the issue for, quote, not enough water is about outdoor non-potable uses.
So do you know some place that's really kind of dialed this in terms of rainwater use for accessory dwelling units?
I don't know the answer to that. I'd maybe do a bit of work, but I would suspect that other regions that have had similar water issues, the Californias out there that are kind of well publicized, would probably have explored some of these options, or finding that around many housing things, they are either experiencing things a little bit ahead of us or a little bit behind. So there's many comparisons there. I would look to that jurisdiction, but yeah, would get back to you with some research after that.
Well, we'd love to task Small Housing BC with some research specific to our region. We know you guys are good at research. But yeah, you know, and as you come up, you know, as you go to other communities around BC, like just, you know, we're always interested to hear what cool infrastructure solutions other places are coming up with, like as well with wastewater and transportation and other things. So yeah, I'd be happy to follow up with you on that at some point, Carl. And I guess, you know, we're here at 8 o'clock, and I'd love to just give you a little bit of time before we wrap up here. If there's any other comments from any three of you, just, you know, in light of like some of the questions that have come up and some of the discussion this evening, if you have any kind of last comments or pitches or thoughts, and, you know, and then I think we can wrap up and let people go about their evening. I really appreciate everyone staying on this long.
I'll kick it off. I guess if I had parting words, it's twofold. One, I think you know, it's interesting to have this discussion because communities are somewhat struggling. I think that the islands for sure are struggling with these pressures, and I think it's important that we remain open to the options. And I think that one of the things that we can most dramatically do is to look at what we ourselves would like to do, how we'd like to accommodate people that we know that are in need, and, you know, be it family members or friends, and how we would best be able to help them. And housing's a big issue, and you know, and I think it's worth that reflection on, you know, what would you like to have beside you, or what would you like to have in your property, to help those people out and have that opportunity to help them, and at the same time, how would that help you? You know, and in a very candid way. You know, this is if people need, if there's financial drivers, if there's care drivers. There's a myriad of things, but I think it's important. We have communities that are in need, and that both our needs, but a larger need. And to do nothing in the face of need is not a great way to build community.
Thank you, Jake.
I think for me, you know, the maybe sort of the parting words and seeing a lot of the stuff come up in the chat where people are talking about, you know, Hornby uses rainwater catchment for potable water, you know, and we've seen other people talking about other islands, is, you know, all the pieces are kind of out there, right? But what we need is really more conversations like this, but also more kind of collecting them and presenting them in ways that people can make use of, right? And so what I mean by that is more information about, you know, what the legalities are and the practicalities and costs are of, you know, using rainwater for potable water, or using it non-potably for flushing, or about the kind of alternative septic systems that I was talking about, or about, you know, what practical building costs are with different, you know, with panel housing, with ICF, with stud, you know, typical stick frame housing on different islands, and so on. And you know, I think what the province has done with standard designs, you know, that they've announced is great, but of course those are not intended for this kind of small housing kind of, you know, island environment. So can we get standard designs for these things, and standard designs with kind of good known costs attached? And the more, I think there's just, you know, each of us has a little piece of the puzzle, each of us has done a little bit of research, but the more we can kind of connect and collect this stuff and make kind of a playbook available to different communities by drawing on the experiences of all of our communities, I think the more we will benefit. So I think that's sort of the thing that I'm most excited about, right, in this work is, yes, let's do this on Galiano, but let's both learn from what people are doing elsewhere and also make as much information as we can available so that other people can learn from what we're doing. Right?
Thanks, Abby. And I'll just interject just one sec before Carl. Sorry, Carl. But just to say that Salt Spring Solutions has started a housing roundtable. It's mostly focused with the nonprofits on the Southern Gulf Islands, but we're testing out what's the best format and, you know, who's most interested to be there. But the idea there is to share information. And I know that we do have friends at the CRD and other places that are thinking about the things that just brought up in terms of, like, you know, what does a standardized composting toilet look like? Can we get the engineering for that so that people don't have to keep going back over and over for that, but we actually have kind of this more rule pattern book, if you will, that saves some of the things that Carl brought up in terms of, like, not everyone having to go through this all themselves and all the costs being borne on one applicant. And instead to actually have something to lean into. So that's just my little plug for our housing roundtable, and maybe Galiano Housing Co-op or Cottage Co-op should be part of that. Anyway, over to you, Carl.
Yeah, and I would just riff on that. Small Housing BC has found that convening people from across jurisdictions, but not just that, I think getting builders involved, so you're not just talking with maybe the potential homeowners, but folks like Jake, but others, your local contractors, getting them involved in the process so that the ideas that are coming in are going to make financial sense, because ultimately people aren't going to be doing this activity if they're losing money. So that has to be a part of the discussion. And so I really applaud what Salt Spring Solutions is doing. I think it's great to convene this event, and your housing roundtable sounds like it's going to bear a lot of fruit. We've seen similar types of roundtables on the South Coast, and think that it's been a really effective tool for learning from each other as to what works and being able to test out different ideas. So kudos to you for that and for putting this event on. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, well, it is. It's totally my pleasure. This has been great. I'd like to really thank our presenters and encourage you to all of our participants here tonight to check out Small Housing BC's website, to also check out Small Works, where Jake is from, and also one day we'll have a full website from the Galiano Housing Co-op, or sorry, Cottage Co-op. I know there's just kind of a smaller one there now, but I think that it's worth tracking what Avi and friends are doing on Galiano, and we certainly will be doing that. Yeah, thanks to all the participants who've come this evening. I really appreciate you spending your evening with us. Some of you may have been on a webinar last night as well, so I appreciate that tremendously. I'd like to encourage you to go to our website, saltspringsolutions.com. You can get the document that I showed in blurred format in crisp format at that website. You can also find out more about what we're doing and stay in touch as other events come forward. And I would be remiss to be a board member and not also say, we'd love donations. We're not a charity, but we are a group of volunteers who are trying to move the dial a little bit. And so any and all donations to Salt Spring Solutions are greatly appreciated. So thanks, everyone, and I hope you have a lovely evening.
Night.
Good night.